We shall now move into Khaw Session 3, Growth and Development. Development and its Complexities, an Industrial Policy by All for All. The session will be chaired by Nick Khaw, Head of Research, Khazanah. He'll be joined by Professor Ha-Joon Chang, author and Professor of Economics, SOAS University of London. Katrine Marcal, author and journalist, Dargens Niherter. And Professor Nathan Lane, Associate Professor in Economics, University of Oxford, who's joining us from Boston. Please welcome our panel speakers.
Good morning, everybody, and well, good evening to Nathan, who is in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the moment. First, I want to thank you, everybody, for being here with us. It's day 2 of KMF. I hope that you had a good time on day 1, and we hope to keep that continuing for day 2. I also want to thank our speakers for being here today, Katrine, Ha-Joon, as well as Nathan. So let me welcome everyone. And one thing I did want to say about day 1 is we heard from a bunch of different folks, and my takeaway from that was that we heard from Marcal, we heard from Ha-Joon, and we also heard from Florence, who spoke about NASA's many attempts yesterday. And the one thing that seemed to come up is that we need to continue to be intellectually promiscuous. So Marco said we need to be geopolitically promiscuous, but we have a different diet, that is being promiscuous with food, with different attempts at innovation, so. But then again, lest people think that we talk too much on promiscuity is really because greater complexity and everything that we're going through just means that we really need to broaden our toolbox, our solution set, or as per KMF2019, our collective brain. So the topic we have for us this morning is on growth and development. It's one of our 4 core sessions at KMF, alongside macro firms and leadership. And we have with us, I'll go in this order, and finally to Nathan on screen, we have Ha-Joon, who you met yesterday during the kickoff session at KMF. He teaches economics at SOAS. Some of you have gotten his books. I think the books yesterday sold out really quickly for both Ha-Joon and Katrine. But don't worry, there's a second round of giveaway today, so if you haven't gotten it, you can get it today. So I'm going to go next to Katrine, who is a best-selling author on women and innovation. Her first book, which I thought the title was really cool, by the way, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? It has been translated to more than 20 languages, one of the Guardian Books of the Year in 2015, and in BBC named you one of the 100 women in 2015, which then makes me wonder where the other 3.5 billion that they didn't name, right? So Katrine works for the Swedish newspaper, I'm going to get this pronunciation wrong, Dargens Niherter? Yeah. And she's given keynotes at many institutions and has interviewed many of the world's leading economic thinkers. Her interviews have been viewed more than 1 million times on YouTube. Her second book is what's available here. It's called Mother of Invention, How Good Ideas Get Ignored in an Economy Built for Men, and will be published in several languages during 2021-2022. She lives in the English countryside with a husband and 3 children. And finally, we get to Nathan. So just a side story here. I first met Nathan a few months ago in May when he came to give a talk in London. And he held some office hours, I got to see him, but I found out there was a dinner later that night. And I self-invited myself, Nathan, so I hope you don't think that I was being a bit stalkerish. But I really wanted to get to know you a bit better because I really appreciate your work. And so Nathan is an associate professor of economics at Oxford, fellow of Merton College at Oxford. He's a co-founder of Soda Labs at Monash University, where he was senior lecturer of economics prior to Oxford. He was also a postdoctoral researcher at MIT. His research focuses on industrial policy and the political economy of industrial development. So for those of you who read the concept paper, thank you to the 11 people who read the concept paper. I appreciate that. And subtracting my team who had to read it, so that's there's 5 people left who actually read it. And I know Hisham read it because he redlined everything, so thank you, Hisham, as well. You know that as we prepare KMF, we like to throw a whole bunch of pop culture references as well. So our session today is no different. So I'm going to start with my favorite book author, and with apologies to Ha-Joon and Katrine and other KMF authors, Stephen King, the horror writer, is, so he's not here, just, So he wrote Salem's Lot, a book about a vampire living in rural Maine. The reason he sets the story in Maine, according to him, is that he imagined that if you had a vampire just drop down in New York City, you would get hit by a cab and that would be the end of vampire. Right? So, okay, at this point, you're reasonably asking, what does this have to do with anything? So if turn on my first slide. So how many of you remember this cartoon? Hands up if you do. So I don't know whether you know, but this is the Jetsons. The team who read the concept paper in my team, they're a bit too young to know. I don't know whether they know, but I think many of the room might know. The father, George Jetson, who's driving the flying car, was actually born on the 31st of July, 2022. And that is this year. So, when we think about that and you imagine, what it's going to look like in 40 years, the question is that this reality that we see here seems very far from where we are now. But the reality where we are today is also very far from what we might have imagined in 1982, and if we go further back, the same thing, right? But that indistinguishability over time is a function of the economic development that the world has seen really since the Industrial Revolution, or by numbers since 1870. So I don't want to ask our panelists, I'm going to stop talking, to repeat successes. I'm going to actually ask the fun question. Over this long period of extended growth that we've seen, what are some of the biggest structural setbacks, weaknesses, failures that you think we need to avoid to have a meaningful path towards a Jetsons-like future? And I'm not saying that we want a Jetsons-like future, I'm just saying towards a future with greater growth and development. So I'm going to start with Katrine to kick off on what you think are the biggest structural setbacks, weaknesses, and failures that we've seen so far, despite the prosperity that we have today.
Okay. So slightly unsurprisingly, I would say that one of the really big failures has been an inability to ask the question, what about women? When it comes to everything, basically. So we can start with this room, can't we? So what's the problem with this room for women?
Oh, I don't know when I'm contractually obliged to say this, but...
No? Well, so I'm going to tell you. The problem with just this room for women is the temperature. Female body, the women here, they know what I'm talking about. The female body, on average, is comfortable in an indoor temperature that's 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer than men, right? So an air conditioning all over the world, hotels, offices, set based on male comfort, male body temperature, which means that if you employ women in your office and there's an air-conditioned environment, they are most often going to be cold, right? And so this is just a small example of this sort of world built for men, an economy built for men that I like to talk about in my books. And there's yes, I know that's just, you can put on a jacket. I actually spilled coffee on mine, so I can't. But there's ways around this. But I do think this question, what about women, is extremely, extremely important. You're talking about the Jetsons and innovation and technology and these sort of things. If you look at investment into innovation, venture capital, for example, I'm from Sweden with a big sort of startup scene. Sweden is a country famous for gender equality. There's this story of the tourist 15 years ago coming from the US to Stockholm, walking around the capital and after an hour saying, what's up with all the gay nannies? Because there's so many men pushing buggies. So, we've done a lot for gender equality in Sweden, but still, looking at innovation, 99% of all venture capital in Sweden goes to men. And that's Sweden, and it's similar all over the world. So this sort of Jetson future you want to build, if you look at where sort of money, when it comes to innovation and technology, is going right now, it is men have almost a complete monopoly on that. So the Jetson future we're building now is a future built by men in a way that it's just economic waste to not sort of use the innovative potential of women in the economies. And we're not doing that because the financial system is not set up for it. talking about, speaking of the financial system, another thing that we talked about yesterday in the macro session was supply chains, right? So it was said that, central banks will not be able to sort of really deal with this inflation. It's about building supply chains for this new world where we have to deal with so many new things. So let's just look at supply chains and ask the question again, sort of what about women? 99% of big procurement contracts in sort of the world economy go to men. World trade almost completely dominated by men. In these supply chains we talk about, women-owned businesses, they're just not there. You take two very different economies, the US and Lebanon, right? So, but what they have in common is that approximately 1/3 of all small businesses in both of these economies are owned by women. But women get 5% of all business loans, both in the US and Lebanon, 5%. So women are just not there. When it comes to supply chains, we know big multinationals, they sort of, they are very, very dominant here. It's very, 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 very hard for women-owned businesses to get into these supply chains because of discrimination at almost every level. From sort of, women can show up with a contract from Walmart, go to the bank, and the bank still doesn't give them a loan. It's sort of discrimination at customs. It's everywhere. It's this huge potential that we are just not using in the world economy and in solving our problems. And that's, so that would be my, what I would like to say here to kick things off. It's that it's a very small question. What about women? When it comes to this room, when it comes to supply chains, when it comes to innovation, because as soon as you ask that question, a lot of things reveal themselves, and you will see this huge potential gap, this huge economic waste that's going on every day, all the time, and that we just simply, given all the challenges in front of us, we just can't afford to go on like this.
Okay, thank you, Katrine. Now let's go to Nathan in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So the same question, Nathan. Over this long period of growth that we've seen, what do you feel, or what do you think are some of the biggest structural setbacks, weaknesses, and failures that we've seen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I like thinking about it as you did through the lens of science fiction, because I think science fiction kind of projects this image of the world where a lot of misery, a lot of these the kind of things we struggled through in the past, well, we've transcended them. We've transcended them because it's the future now. Things are better. And the one thing I worry about, given the conditions of growth and structural change as we're experiencing it now, is that at the bottom end of the spectrum, at the bottom end of the income distribution, or the poor countries, or even within countries, poor populations or certain groups are excluded from the growth and productivity change and technological change that we experience. So I'm wondering if the political institutions and institutional frameworks that exist that determine who benefits from growth or technological change is distorted such that certain people don't benefit from these massive improvements in well-being that could potentially be had. And that's the thing that's kind of incongruent and kind of unfortunate about the state of the world we live in now relative to science fiction, the idea of Star Trek. You look at Star Trek on TV, and it's projecting this image of the world that's beautiful. And I think underneath this, undergirding all the kind of robots and all the fantasy world that they've constructed is actually a world that's kind of free from the nastiness and the brutishness that we confront in the 20th or 21st century. But if you see what's going on right now, and if you see what's happening in certain pockets of the world, that's surely not what's happening. If you think of things like climate change or COVID, people can escape from these shocks and these types of things very much unscathed by virtue of technology. But then the harm is very much concentrated amongst the most vulnerable. that is the institutions that kind of allow us to transcend crises and shocks, well, they leave many people slip through the cracks systematically. And I think that's kind of one of the failures of our current system, is that, I could say this kind of, I guess, in a concise but abstract way, the politics and our institutions are such that people are systematically excluded from the benefits of amazing stuff that's happening and the progressive forces of capitalism. And I think that's something that's dire and missing. And it also determines, to some of our speakers on stage, it also determines what types of technologies and what types of institutions get put in place, what types of questions we ask. And so I'd say it comes down to politics and institutions, and that's a big failure.
Thank you, Nathan. A couple of points on that. And I think on your point on who's left out, and you mentioned about what about women. And I think we saw earlier from Professor Stephanie's presentation that where you are on the socioeconomic distribution then determines your policy preferences, and therefore the kinds of politicians we vote in, the kinds of institutions we have, the kind of culture we have, and it's kind of endogenous. The second point I want to make is Nathan started out about science fiction. We did not script this. I know people like to think we like to talk about science fiction stuff, but he did that on his own, I promise. But I will now pass to Ha-Joon, who literally wrote a chapter on economics and science fiction. So he doesn't just write about food, he writes also about science fiction. But maybe the same question, Ha-Joon, and since we could get on that point on science fiction, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I am a fan of science fiction, and a few years ago I got to contribute to a chapter mainly written by kind of science fiction writers and sociologists and so on, on the economics and science fiction. So I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. But looking at the pictures of Jetsons, you know, I was reminded, I was born in 1963, and when I was a kid, like in the early to mid 1970s, you know, that kind of future was supposed to have arrived by 1999. Yeah? So we all drive in flying cars, and our dinner will be 3 pills, yeah, that give us all. I'll die in that world, you know. I mean, if I can eat proper food, you know, but I mean, this is probably dreamed up about NASA scientists that who have to send people into space, but you know, but yeah, we haven't got there yet. No, the point that I was making in the science fiction and economics article was, I mean, there were a couple of other things, but the most important point that I was making was science fiction is a very useful thought experiment for economics, yeah? Because you are basically changing the big parameters. What if the technologies were so advanced no one died, yeah? Or what if there was a nuclear holocaust, then the technology went back to the Middle Ages, yeah? And then once technology changes, institutions change, yeah? So you know, the kind of the post-nuclear holocaust world, that we actually go back to the Middle Ages in terms of institutions as well, because the institutions need to be supported by technologies, yeah? And then you realize, hang on, if science fiction is such a thought experiment, that actually history is the mirror image, yeah? So if you look at history, it's a world with different technologies, yeah, like post-climate crisis or post-Holocaust, nuclear Holocaust world, without even the memory of advanced technologies, yeah? So then you get to look at history and try to learn, you know, what technology has done, what institutions are doing, yeah? Because once you live in an established system, you begin to take things for granted, yeah? I mean, turning the tap, water comes out, yeah? A lot of women in the developing countries have to walk like 2-3 hours every day just fetching water, but the people who don't live in that kind of places think the water's, yeah, just there, yeah? But in order to supply water to us like that, we need huge infrastructure, yeah? A lot of technologies, yeah? So I was just trying to promote science fiction, you know, that even if boring people like economists, you should read science fiction because it makes you think about what you're actually writing about. But in answer to your question, yeah, it's very much in line with what Katrine and Nathan was saying. I think when you have the extended period of prosperity, you have two problems that will kind of brew in the background. One is that people begin to, their way of thinking begins to ossify. Because exactly because you have been successful, you think, oh yeah, this is the way you do it. But then the new challenges constantly come. We are living in that kind of phase. The climate change, new pathogens and whatnot. And you cannot think so-called outside the box to deal with these new problems. And then also that you begin to kind of engage in groupthink, because this is the way it has been done. Free trade is good, globalization is even better, blah blah blah. So I think that's one big danger. But the other danger is that the social structure ossifies. And then I've seen it in my own life. When I was a kid, young man, South Korea had a very flat social structure, flattened by colonial rule, land reform, Korean War, and kind of very underfunded but well-organized public education system meant that it was possible literally to have come from the poorest peasant family and become the biggest companies of CEOs of biggest companies, or the Supreme Court judge or top scientist. But now, exactly because we had this economic success, we have created this the upper middle class people who have the kind of the money and political power and knowledge to manipulate the system so that their children benefit and social mobility is vastly reduced. This is why you are getting all these Korean movies and dramas like the Parasite, the Squid Game, and more recently Little Women, which portray this very, very dark reality of the country. Because now, unless you come from a good family with money to give you private tutoring, send you at least to cramming school, you don't even stand a chance. And we have, our upper class people have also learned from the Americans to make sure that the extracurricular activities are reflected in university admissions. This is basically a ticket for the middle class. So you have to be very careful, because once the new generation begin to realize that there is no future for them, then they become very susceptible to this populist thinking. We want something now, because I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 years, 20 years.
What you're saying is essentially that what we think of as meritocracy has essentially become inherited. It's potentially inherited because obviously if you're rich, you want the best for your kids and so on, and it gets inherited. Yeah,
it's in a way worse than the old feudal system, because then you openly said that it's the blood, But now you pretend that it's not blood, it's merit. But the merit is gained by, in some countries, legacy studentship, which means that you go to certain universities simply because your parents or grandparents went there. Your parents can fund your internships and the extracurricular activities that give you advantage in the university admission. So it's even worse than the old system, because you are pretending that it's not by blood, but it is.
So I think you just made a lot of people You just made a lot of people feel very like a shiver run down their back. They're like, oh, this sounds like me. But anyway, I want to go back to Katrine. And here I just want to talk about the work of some of the three of you. And actually, I'm going to ask a little bit about the work, but also if you could share what you think are some next concrete steps that corporates, policymakers can take as to how to solve some of the issues that you raise in your own work, right? So I'm going to go to Katrine first. So I just want to say, your book, The Mother of Invention, has been one of the most eye-opening books I've read in a very long time. And I really encourage everyone to read it. And I encourage everyone to read the works of other people as well, but I really encourage everyone to read Katrine's book too.
Likes mine more,
So in it, you describe a wealth of inventions that were set aside because they weren't masculine enough for society. And one of them in particular has been coming back with the rage, is all the rage now in the world with electric vehicles. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that. And I really like the term you have. We've been innovating with one hand behind our back. Mm-hmm. So if you could talk a little bit more about that and maybe what you've seen in some places where they've tried to make you innovate with two hands in front to share with the audience.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, so electric vehicles, all the rage now. What many people don't know is how old this form of technology is. So I live outside of London in the UK, and in the 1800s in London, you could phone up an electric taxi company, and they would come and pick you up and drive you to where you wanted to go. So electric vehicles have been around since the dawn of the automobile era, and then, of course, they ended up disappearing for different reasons, and we ended up building a whole world for petrol-driven technology. And part of this story is actually about gender bias, because electric vehicles, pretty soon when they came around, and particularly on the American market, which became very dominant for sort of the development of cars, they became seen as feminine. Because, so the same year that Henry Ford launches the T-Ford, which is a petrol-driven car, and with this sort of vision of making a car for everyone, a car that even the workers in the factories can afford to buy. The same year that he launches this car for everyone that people retrospectively had said sort of the car that put the world on wheels, his own wife goes out and buys not a T-Ford, but an electric vehicle. And that wasn't a coincidence, because by then they were largely marketed to women. They were these sort of rich women's cars, and the advertisements are amazing from that era. Women with big hats, sort of getting into these. Clara Ford's car had an inbuilt crystal vase for flowers, which you won't find in the new Tesla, I think.
Don't give them ideas.
Yeah, I am gonna give them ideas. I have a lot of ideas. So they were. Because there was this assumption that here you have this vehicle that's safe, comfortable, slower, very good for sort of short trips where you really need your car to start, but maybe you don't need to go very far. Perfect for that. And then the assumption was this must be a car for women. Because it just is. It's not smelly, it's not dangerous, you don't have to risk your life by sort of cranking the engine going. This is for the ladies. They were even talked about as drawing rooms on wheels. And the electric car industry did quite well for a bit, sort of marketing to women, selling to women, product developing with women in mind. Electric vehicles were the first cars that were created with roofs. Because again, there was this assumption that a real man doesn't really need a roof on his car, right? It's too tough. It actually takes quite a long time before sort of roofs become standard even in petrol-driven cars. But what then happened was, I guess you can guess, it's sort of soon this actually becomes a bit of a commercial problem for the electric car industry, because the market sort of changes, families, they can only afford one car, these sort of new groups they're trying to sell to, and then the electric vehicle is a lady's car. So it's not tough, it's not cool, it's not something that male consumers want, and by the sort of the beginning of the 1900s, the electric car industry in the US is complaining about how the electric vehicle has been branded a car for, quote, the aged, the infirm, and the women. And they're trying to sort of rebrand, they can't really do it, and then for other reasons. So this isn't the main reason. Not even I would say this is the main reason for the electric car disappearing. There were battery problems, and there were a couple of big investments into this that didn't work out for different reasons. But automobile historians, they talk about other cultural factors. And I say, of course, this is not other cultural random factors that led to the demise of the electric car. It's gender bias. It's this idea that if a product is for women, it's not really technology. It's not even a car. It's a drawing room on wheels. It's nothing to really invest in, you know. So this sort of ties back to, you know, the difficulties that female-centered products have today of getting investments. Is exactly the same thing. But this happened when it came to this huge technological choice. Are we going to build a world for electric vehicles or petrol-driven vehicles or both in a way? And we chose petrol, and one of the reasons for that was actually gender bias. And that's how important these things actually are. Yeah.
Okay.
End of rant.
You can continue. Okay, so the other point that you write in your book, which I really like, so I think, you know, there are a lot of really good quotes in your book that I've used. Actually, I mean, I quoted you, don't worry, I didn't.
Yeah. You didn't steal it.
Yeah, I didn't steal it. So you write, what we choose to invest in as a society says a lot about what we value and we don't. So with that, I'm going to go to Ha-Joon, and then I'm going to pivot back to Nathan after. So Ha-Joon, you know, in edible economics, as well as your previous books, right? So you have several food items that basically highlight the importance of industrialization and industrial policy, which has been coming back in recent years. And I want to get to that. So you mentioned anchovies, prawn, beef, noodle, which sounds like laksa. So I don't know if laksa is industrial policy, but could you talk about why industrialization is so important? And you know, it's a follow-on from yesterday, right? How do we finance it in a world where interest rates are going up, in a world where capital is going to be more tight, and all of that? And somebody has to pay the cost, because you know, we talked about banks and what is a socially optimal non-performing loan rate. Somebody has to pay for it. Where do we get that?
Yeah, no, industrialization is important above all because we are material beings. Yeah? I mean, we cannot live on watching videos. Yeah? I mean, we have to eat, we have to live in a comfortable house, we have to heat it, we need safe drinking water. You know, basically, we live in this world that we live because of industrialization. Yeah? Let's not forget that. Yeah? Also, that's where most of the technological innovation comes from. Yeah? Even in the United States and the United Kingdom, where manufacturing industry account for barely 10% of national output these days, 60–70% of R&D is conducted in the manufacturing industries. Yeah? In countries like South Korea or Germany, where manufacturing still account for more than 20% of GDP, 80–90% of R&D is in the manufacturing sector. Yeah? So even the rise in the productivity of agriculture and services, they mainly owe to innovations in the manufacturing industries. Yeah? Artificial fertilizers, the pesticide, yeah? I mean, the electric motors for irrigation, you know, tractors. Yeah? These days they use drones to monitor the crops and the cattle. Yeah? I mean, in services, I mean, all this inventory management, logistics, they won't be there without the development in the computer industry. Yeah? So, you know, this is where the innovation mainly comes from, and in order to maintain our kind of material progress, I mean, manufacturing sector is vital. Yeah? I mean, I could go on. I mean, there are at least 4 or 5 more reasons that I could give, but you know, given the limited amount of time, I'm going to move on to the next question. Now, if industrialization is so important, how do you finance it? I mean, well, I think the financing difficulty is real, yet not so real, because it's real in the sense that, yes, I mean, especially because it's a physical investment, you need actually the resources to go in there, whether they are metal or energy or whatever, and these things are costly. Yeah? So you need financing for it. But on the other hand, just think about the investment that go into things like the high-end real estate development, which really don't add to productivity. A lot of it is what the American economist Thorstein Veblen called conspicuous consumption. Yeah? So that you could actually rechannel some of the resources. I mean, by reorganizing the public transport system and the living spaces, we could actually conserve a lot of resources, because a lot of resources, real and financial, go into developing suburbs, and I mean that everyone driving in their own cars, and so that through reorganization of society, we can also create resources for this financing. But I mean, the problem is that kind of real in the sense that, given the financial system, especially given the way it has become more and more short-term oriented in the recent periods because of the globalization of finance, which some people call financialization of the economy, long-term patient capitalists are becoming less and less available. Yeah? So just to give you a very quick intuitive example, in the 1970s, the average period of shareholding in the United Kingdom was just over 5 years. Yeah? So on average, the stock investor buys a share, and then he or she keeps it for 5 years. Yeah? Now it's not even a year. Yeah? So basically, the managers have to manage the company with a time horizon of at most 1 year, ideally 2 quarters, 3 quarters, and very few manufacturing investment bring fruits within that time horizon. So that needs to change. Yeah? So a lot of countries are now setting up development banks. Yeah? Sovereign wealth funds are moving away from the financial investment into real sector investment. So I see some hope, but unless we change this financial system, financing industrialization is going to be very difficult. No?
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to go to Nathan. So, Nathan, in your recent work, which I devoured, it's a must-read, I want to say, for all policymakers in the room, looking to understand what we know and what we don't know about industrial policy. So, Nathan, you write, without a doubt, future research must do more to understand the interaction between political economy and industrial policy. Because industrial policy is state policy, its success, scope, and efficacy is sensitive to institutional context, end quote. No policy, basically, however technically brilliant, will come to light if the political economy is not in place for it, right? Could you elaborate more on your work on industrial policy, especially on the political economy? What do we know? What do we not know about this interaction?
Yeah, well, it's a bit unfortunate because most of my work has focused on, well, the kind of tiny little mechanisms of industrial policy that people argue about. Is it theoretically justified? Can countries target spillovers? All these kind of very nitty-gritty questions, all these kind of in-the-weeds questions. And what's been happening in economics, mainstream economics, with the help of Professor Chang's work decades prior, is we've begun to get kind of like a sense of actually these types of little tiny details of industrial policy, kind of what works and what doesn't in very isolated moments. And we're building up a kind of full-fledged picture that's relatively robust. It's like, well, a lot of these little mechanisms seem to be working. A lot of these theoretical justifications for industrial policy, well, they seem right. They seem right if things are implemented right and implemented correctly. And it's been a bit unsatisfying to people because it's like, oh, we've done all this empirical work to figure out, well, can things be possible? Does it really work? But in the end, it's like, well, it comes down to the politics and the kind of structures that actually implement these rules, right? You can look at the Biden administration right now, who we talk to a lot, who just pushed forward this like giant and new industrial policy agenda with the CHIPS Act and this other thing called the IRA. And there's big, grandiose, visionary policy being done, but with theoretical justifications underlying it, undergirding it. But everyone's kind of looking around in the room and thinking, well, how do we actually make this stuff work in practice? What are the political institutions in place or bureaucratic institutions in place that make this stuff function? And we're kind of a little empty-handed if we were to like, think, well, what's the data say? Well, because there's no data. And so these things become just very salient, these political issues kind of underlying all these things. That is, we kind of have a sense that there's theoretical justifications for how these things ought to work, but it's kind of beside the fact because it's embedded in this larger political context that actually has to do the real work. And you see really interesting things happening there. Going back to Katrine's work as well, I was thinking as she was talking about what was happening in the US the past month, right? They were able to push forward this amazing legislation that's pretty grandiose, especially for the US, who's not been like overtly a bastion of industrial policy. Like, you know, on the down low they have, but not this overt. And they push forward all this industrial policy. And they originally had these types of visions of doing kind of security-oriented supply chain stuff, but also there was this focus that has been forgotten already, that they were going to focus on the care economy, the service economy, the kind of thinking about can we subsidize forms of service labor for age-old homes and this kind of feminized work, this kind of feminized sector that we traditionally think about that needs so much investment in the US. And that whole pocket of industrial policy, because of the politics, has completely drifted away and was sunk. Now we have the defense-oriented stuff, we have the silicon chip-oriented stuff, but this giant service part of the industrial policy package has faded away because, well, we don't value that type of stuff. We don't have the political constituencies to push for the feminized part of the labor force that we were actually going to direct policy to at one moment of time. Well, that's gone. That's off the table. Why? And so you see that these political things matter and these kind of political forces matter, but when it comes to a bird's eye view of what we know about the context of industrial policy that makes it work or not, well, we have kind of a piecemeal picture of things. But if someone were to ask, well, what's the state of industrial policy practice around the world? I couldn't tell you. If we were to think, how does it vary by institutions? How does it vary by politics? Don't know. We have case studies. But one comment I would always get was, well, we know industrial policy works in autocracies, but what about, if democracies don't do this? And when we go out and measure industrial policy like we have just recently, we actually find that the richest nations, to Professor Chang's actual kind of earlier work, that the richest nations, the liberal OECD democracies are the ones doing industrial policy the most. But I think the question is, what shapes its efficacy insofar as the political institutions that deploy these things? Right? And what shapes the sectors that get targeted, much like these gender dynamics that we were referring to earlier, or these class dynamics that we alluded to earlier. And these are still things that my answer is going to be unsatisfying. It's that we don't know. We don't know systematically. And just collectively as a profession in economics, my push is just we need to measure this stuff. We need to actually pay attention to it because it's serious stuff. It matters. And now that countries are doing this, now that industrial policy has returned, we've been saying that for the last decade. Well, how has it returned? And what does it interact with? And in that sense, we know very little. And that's, a somewhat unsatisfying answer. I'm sorry, I wish I could say more, but Yeah,
No,
we're
thank you,
kind of empty
thank you,
handed.
Nathan. So
Yeah.
that's very helpful, and it's very helpful because to Dr. Faisal and to the members of the board of Khazanah, where we presented Dana Impact and we said there's a lot we don't know. Professor who did a review on it is now confirming it, so I just want to make sure that. Okay, now in the spirit of trying new things, which is what you have to do, industrialization, I'm going to do something which is a little high risk, high reward. High risk for me more than really anybody else, in case Dr. Faisal doesn't let me work on KMF anymore after this. I'm going to do a session, a rapid fire session. We have half an hour to go. I call it overrated or underrated. I mean, I guess properly rated, you could also say that. So there's a podcast, so this is not my idea. If you follow the Conversations with Tyler podcast by an economist named Tyler Cohen, he does this segment called Overrated, Underrated, where he shares a few words or phrases and asks his guests to say whether it's overrated or underrated. Members of the audience, if you have a view, feel free to share as well at this point. You can raise your hand if I ask a question, and then you can answer as well. I'm going to give the chance to anyone who would like to answer. There's no obligation to answer. But I'm going to start with this, and again, members of the audience, I welcome your participation. So this one is meant specifically for Nathan and for Katrine, because we know Ha-Joon's views about it from yesterday. All three of you are people not from the UK, currently living in the UK. So, first question, British food, underrated or overrated? This one you two have to answer.
It's British food today.
Yeah.
Underrated, yeah.
Yeah, today. Yeah.
Today, yeah.
Yeah, your point was many years
Yeah.
ago. Right? And Nathan?
He's
I'm going to have a hot
speechless.
take.
Speechless.
I'm
Sorry?
going to have a hot take. It puts me on the spot because I get into fights about this a lot. I'd say all the jokes about British cuisine are exactly on point. And it's neutral. It's where it ought to be. It deserves the ridicule that it gets. It's right there. It's perfect. Not underrated or overrated. It's rated precisely, I think.
Just like Singaporean food, huh? So, okay, another question, and this one more on the corporate side. And we've spoken a lot about this, including on sustainability practice, ESG practices. So this one, quotas for women on board and management, overrated or underrated? Maybe this one is.
Yeah, I mean, underrated should be used more, yeah.
Okay. Any other views? By the way, again, audience participation very welcome at this point. Huh? Nathan, yeah, you.
Yeah, I think we need them, but in that respect, I think they're overrated. I think we need more,
Okay.
especially for the
Yeah, I
rank
agree
and
with that,
file
actually.
workforce.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of a number that's quite easy to focus on, and
Absolutely.
yeah, and often that's not where the real power is, and so
Sure.
okay.
Okay, next question. Artificial intelligence as replacement for workers, overrated or underrated?
Overrated.
Overrated.
Okay, you can give explanation.
Yeah, no, basically there'll be, I mean, a lot of work, especially kind of white-collar work like what most people in this room do, will be replaced by artificial intelligence, yeah? No, believe me, I mean, why is there such a panic about employment? Automation is basically the core of capitalism, yeah? History of capitalism is history of automation, yeah? But so far, the blue-collar workers have been told, this is capitalism, get over it, yeah? You have to accept that machines replacing you, yeah? Now there's a panic about employment because now the white-collar people who are writing about these things are going to be replaced, yeah? So, yeah, I mean, wait for it, but, yeah, I mean, essentially, my view is that there will be the replacement of a lot of work, but there'll always be things that only humans can do. Yeah? So in that sense, just think about it. I mean, we have, machines have displaced literally billions and billions and billions of jobs in the last 250 years of history of capitalism. Yeah? But there are still work. Yeah? So it's not like these machines will completely replace people.
Katrine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think also there is a very interesting gender aspect to many of sort of the studies where economists try to guess which jobs will be replaced by robots and which ones will not. Because they very often find that many of the very female-dominated sectors of the labor market seem to be less likely to be automated, because the skills that women have for different reasons been told to specialize in are, it's either those, it's something like cleaning is incredibly hard to automate. A bank is quite easy to automate, right? Cleaner very hard.
What about equity analysts?
Yeah, you're gone. I have no idea, I'm just making this up. No, but I do know about gender and AI, because I do talk about this in my book as well. But I mean, care work, for example, is, we might have, in your science fiction future, there might be robots being able to do those things. But many of these sort of emotional skills, interpersonal skills, certain types of bodily skills, very, very hard to automate. Women tend to specialize into those type of roles, those type of parts of the labor market. So, it could be that the robots are actually coming for the men. And what will happen then? That's something I do talk about in Mother of Invention, because you can see that play out in different ways. Yeah, this was a very long answer to a very short, rapid-fire question. So, yeah, but you can read the book if you're interested.
No, you should absolutely read the book. Nathan, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I still think it's, I think I agree mostly with both, with my two colleagues up here, and but like, I do think there's aspects of it that are a bit overrated. And in particular, I think it's still going to affect low-skilled, white-collar, or low-skilled work on average. In particular, kind of repetitive type tasks are the things that are most replaceable by AI, to Katrine's point. And that these things are going to have massive effects and are going to be very consequential still if we are to take the history of capitalism seriously in ways we don't anticipate and can't. And I think we still haven't fully anticipated the disturbances and kind of social upheaval that can be a consequence of those things. And if we think about the first waves of technological change that came with the computer, that replaced low-end secretarial work. It's like happening now with AI and the type of kind of low-end kind of white-collar work that's being kind of automated away very, very rapidly. And I think that will happen more, and we see it happening before our eyes. But I still think it's a bit underrated insofar as the contradictions and weird stuff that will occur as a result of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
go
go
say
ahead.
one more thing. No, but and also, I mean, in a way, if you want higher productivity, you want people to be replaced by machines, but you also, that's how you get higher productivity. But you also want political institutions to sort of retrain the people that have been let go into sort of higher value jobs, and you get higher productivity, you do those type of investments in those type of programs, and then you actually have a possibility to sort of raise living standards and wages without causing inflation. So it could be a very virtuous circle as well, but again, it's about how you politically manage it with institutions and programs and these sort of things.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to shoot one more last one for a couple of reasons. I really want to get to Q&A from the crowd, and also I feel sometimes you can only do something high risk, high reward long enough, otherwise you stop while the going's good. Okay, last one, since actually, Katrine, you brought up a bunch of economists trying to figure out which jobs are going to get replaced. So here's one, and I can say this because I'm an economist. Economics as a lens of development, overrated or underrated?
What type of economics, right? Yeah.
Yes, that's the answer.
Well, no, in general, right? So that's the point, to elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I was trying to explain yesterday, I mean, there are different schools of economics, and some of them are not even interested in development as a real issue. Yeah? So I mean, there are schools which are interested in development in the sense that we understand, at least in this room. You know, so that going way back to people like Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List and whole bunch of development economists like Simon Kuznets, Albert Hirschman, Gunnar Myrdal, Mikhail Kalecki in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, there are economists for whom the development of the productive capabilities and the resulting structural change in economy and society have been at the center of their interest. Yeah? So that kind of economics that matters a lot. Yeah? For is that excellent for understanding development. But neoclassical school, the dominant school of economics, I mean, it does have some important things to say about development, but it's not this main concern. It's about the efficiency of the market mechanism. Keynesians are not that interested in development because their interest is macroeconomy, fiscal policy. John Maynard Keynes once famously said that in the long run we are all dead. Yeah.
True though.
Yeah, no, he was kind of.
Well,
yeah.
It depends, because we could imagine a science fiction future where we're not.
Yeah, upload your
people watch
conscience.
Black
The
Mirror.
key word there is imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't call that living, but yeah, let's. Yeah.
All right, Nathan, Katrine, any other views?
I have some, yeah. I guess I'm a development economist. I'm kind of knee deep in it. And in a way, I think, to give a very wonky answer, development economics right now is becoming very much like applied philanthropy. It's about running little experiments in the field, which are very precise and niche and kind of answering very kind of simple questions, not very granular questions about educational interventions, things that are very, very important. But the goal is eventually is kind of in the grand scheme of things, applied philanthropy. That's what development economics has become. If you think about the Nobel Prize winners for the last couple of years or the last couple of rounds of development economics have been this type of work. Little, very kind of granular public policy oriented stuff. And so I actually think we've begun to undervalue economics writ large and kind of bigger forms of big schools of economic thought and the role that they play in describing and thinking about forces of economic development. So I'd say that's a long-winded way of saying I think it's a bit underrated actually, which is weird to say. Yeah.
Okay. Katrine?
Yeah, I'd agree, and I particularly point to feminist economics as underrated when it comes to these things. Yeah.
All right. Great. Okay, let's go to Q&A. I'm going to take from the crowd first. Any questions? So I see two in front here. If we can get the mics over to them. In front, right in front here. Yeah. So, okay.
Thank you very much, Nick. My name is Nuripa Kamso. I want to talk about gender bias that was brought up by Katrine. I thought it was really interesting when you say United States is as bad as Lebanon when it comes to access to capital. Only 5% of the women were able to access for capital in both US and the United States. I lecture in St. Joseph University, Beirut, Lebanon, for the past 8 years, master students. And 90% of my students are actually ladies. And there was 1 year out of this 8 years, we don't have a single man in class. They're all ladies. So how? And I followed up with them, and they actually enter into the economic ecosystem after that, Now, how do we reconcile this abundance of women in the education system in Lebanon economically? I think we need to forget the political system in Lebanon in answering this, if that makes sense at all. Thank you.
Sorry, it was a little bit hard to hear.
Could you repeat the
repeat
question?
the question bit.
The question is, with most of my master students in St. Joseph University, largely women and female, how do you reconcile the findings that you have versus what is on the ground that I face?
What do you teach?
Because what do I teach? Masters, they are LLM student. Yeah. And it's fundamental of Islamic financial contracts.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. I mean, it's a complex picture. The progress of women, and what you referenced, these sort of amazing, increased, women just becoming so, very dominant in many fields, and and getting so well educated, and and all of that being amazing, and then somehow that not translating into progress in other areas. I think that's just part of the the complexity of the picture that we really need to grasp. And I do think that particularly the financial system has a very, very big problem, because it doesn't seem to matter if it's so that figure, Lebanon and US comparison, it comes from Professor Linda Scott, who's done work into this, who's somebody you should invite next year to talk about these things. I just think there's too little research into a lot of these things. A lot of things we don't understand. Women make progress in one thing and then doesn't translate into another thing. And at some level we have this narrative of things just of course we kind of let women out and now it's just moving forward, maybe too slow, but it's like still this idea of a movement like that. And that's not really the picture if you start looking into numbers and different aspects. And if, even in Sweden we love to think of ourselves as having solved many of these problems, and and we haven't. We have less venture capital going to women than the US has. We have a similar gender pay gap as other European countries that do much less in terms of public policy for women. There are so many paradoxes when it comes to these things, and it's understudied. And I think particularly these sort of comparisons between countries is we don't do it enough. And I think we don't have enough understanding, and that's why I can't really, unfortunately, answer you. But more than to say that it's full of these paradoxes where progress in one area doesn't translate into progress in another one, and it's depressing, but it's also, I think, it's very, very interesting.
All right, the gentleman.
Nicholas, if we can go back to your earlier question about rating British food.
Yes.
Isn't it now the so-called British food, Indian chicken tikka and Chinese fried rice takeaway?
So I've never lived there, so I'm not the person to answer.
I mean, I don't know if I'm that, I don't see myself as a food critic, and I know you do. No, I mean, I think the improvement in British food has to do with foreign influence and what you were talking about yesterday about the British kind of realizing that, what did you say? They suck at food, right? Yeah, end of quote. So yes, I do think it's one of these benefits of globalization, right?
Yeah, so there should be a slight distinction between British food and food in Britain, yeah?
Yeah, true. True.
So food in Britain is fantastic, yeah? Very good. British food is much better than it used to be. But you are starting from a very low base.
Yeah. I agree. I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. All right, any other questions? Or Nathan, if you want to chime in a little more. Okay, we have a question at the back, number 4, and I see another hand over there. But we'll go with number 4 first.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mei Yi. Mr. Chang, you were talking about the ossification of generational advantages, and this time justified through meritocracy. Are there any interesting studies to overcome this? How do we close the social capital gap between the haves and the have-nots?
Can I say quickly?
Yeah, sure.
So I hope you're around later today because we have somebody who will talk about precisely that in education. She'll be speaking later in the Malaysian context.
That is awesome. That's the field I'm working in. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Yeah, no, there are many different ways of doing this. Yeah, so one well-known model is Scandinavian style welfare state. You know, if you look at the correlation between people's income with their parents' income, which income group they belong to, the correlation is in the US and the UK are like 80%. Yeah? In Scandinavia, in the Netherlands and so on, it's 30 to 40%. Yeah? Yeah, we cannot and we should not completely eliminate parental influence. Yeah? Because I believe that people should be rewarded for investing in their children. Yeah? But it shouldn't dominate. Yeah? So by setting up a welfare state with free education, free healthcare, unemployment benefit, training and retraining, you can actually smooth out a lot of this parental influences. Yeah? So that's one standard way. But there are people thinking about, and I still believe that that's the best way. But there are people thinking about other things like giving each child a capital fund. Yeah. So that they could at least have some inheritance, even though they come from poor family. Yeah? I mean, I think it's an idea that we could explore. I mean, in Singapore, they have done that to an extent by basically nationalizing all the land and providing most of housing through government housing corporation called the Housing Board. Yeah. So there are different ways of doing it, but essentially you need to provide the good childhood to every child, by guaranteeing some basic living standard for every family and giving them access to education and building the education system which would choose more according to, if you like, the raw potential rather than the polishing that later comes with the family income. Yeah?
Thank you. And this is something that actually our research institute, Khazanah Research Institute, has also advocated, precisely that point. All right, I'm going to go to Nathan with the next question. I'm going to take the next virtual question here, but I promise we'll get back to the crowd. Nathan, especially from your vantage point in Oxford, and right now you're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so the question goes, how will our obsession with tech firms who are building more elaborate virtual worlds with more resources and employing more economists affect industrial policy?
Oh, tremendously so, I think. For better or worse, and I speak as someone uncomfortably who's some of my family works for Meta, so I'm stabbing them in the back a bit. But I think for the worse, I think a lot of people are being hired by these firms and are essentially helping them consolidate their monopoly power, right? And I think that can easily feed into these firms lobbying for industrial policies that disproportionately benefit them and things like that. So I think it's absolutely something that will happen and maybe even is as we speak, if we think of the contemporary industrial policies that are being deployed in especially Western Europe and in the US. So absolutely, I think it's a complete red flag. And I think those are not the industrial policies that we want. For sure. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going back to the crowd. I see there was a question number 8 over there, and number 6. Can we take both, and then we'll get folks to answer? Just in a matter of time, I just want to get more questions up.
Yeah. Good morning. My question is actually on the topic that's being discussed, which is industrial policy by all, for all. We heard today the importance of industrial policy and its impact on the world, because there seems to be a shift of focus away from industrial policy. It's about the question of by all, for all. Given the incredible power of politics in these decisions in terms of what has to happen, Do you see this shifting? I think many developing countries put a lot of focus on industrial policy. How is this going to be? What is the outlook for strong industrial policy in the future, given everything that's happening at the moment?
Great question. Okay, sorry, I know I promised we go there, but I think this question, maybe I could get Nathan to comment, and maybe after that, Ha-Joon and Katrine, if you want to add some stuff. But we'll start with Nathan, because it's literally done the literature review on this.
Yeah, no, and I think lately what we're seeing is that the potential is really, really high. I think we're going to see more of it, in particular in this climate. I think this supply chain issues and COVID have only kind of magnified the kind of reasonings and rationales for countries to pursue industrial policies, for better or worse. I'm not making any value judgment there. And you've already seen the upward trend in industrial policy that we've seen for the past, let's say, 15 years, just ramping up even more, in particular in the developing world. I actually think we see much less in the developing world than we would expect. I think we would expect a lot more of it. That said, I think the politics in the developing world are even probably more sensitive to capture and strange distortive effects of where that industrial policy gets allocated, because of some of the weak institutionalized democracies that exist and kind of institutional forces that these countries are always having to combat. I say this as someone who lives part-time in developing countries. Yeah.
Okay, any comments, Ha-Joon?
Yeah, no, I think the most important area of industrial policy will be and should be regarding industries related to environmental sustainability. Yeah? And this will especially concern developing countries for a number of reasons. Yeah, one is that a lot of them have very high potential for renewable energy. Yeah? So now you don't actually have to produce oil to be able to have a lot of energy, because now you can do it with solar.
Solar, yeah.
Yeah, solar, wind, yeah, geothermal. Many African countries have the high geothermal potentialities, and this gives them a chance to actually industrialize at a relatively low energy cost and at a relatively low impact on Earth, yeah, the environment, yeah. And also these are new industries opening up, whether it's renewable energy, batteries, carbon capture, or whatever. I mean, I don't know exactly which technologies are going to win. These are new industry opening up gives a new window opportunity for developing countries, because in those industries, of course, the rich countries are ahead, but the gap is relatively small, yeah? Because these guys are also exploring on the frontier. So here's your chance. Yeah, the one important reason for East Asian economic miracle was that the various reasons they got into electronics before other countries. Yeah, and that was the new frontier, and that gave many of them opportunities. So I think because of these reasons, climate-related industrial policies are going to be very, very important, and a lot of developing countries will try. Not all of them will succeed. Many of them will kind of move ahead with these things.
Okay, so related to the question is actually a virtual question here. Maybe I can direct this to Katrine. Politics are dominated by men in many parts of the world, here included. Do you think this has, to what extent has, let me rephrase the question a bit, because it has impacted inclusivity. Mm-hmm. So to what extent has this impacted inclusivity in terms of policy building, including on industrial policy, and therefore on innovation?
Yeah, I mean, massively, I think. And, and one of the things to sort of, it's so important to have women at all of those tables. But it's also, it's deeper than that. I think it's in the very definition, and Nathan was touching on this, is like, what counts as industrial policy? Then immediately you start thinking, big, you know, male workers, male-dominated industries, and the money sort of magically goes that way. And so I think one of the challenges is to actually think much broader on industrial policy. So I'm from Sweden, and there's a lot of industrial policy now because it's northern Sweden, which is very cold and very dark in the winter. There's a bit of an industrial wonder going on there right now because there's green steel development, there's battery factories, and their big problem is that they need people to come up there and work. And they will go anywhere. If there's anybody in this room who's willing to move to northern Sweden and work there, they will happily, they're desperate for, it's really booming. And so and I've been up there a lot because one of the big problems for sort of the programs being put in place is, they can't get people, and how do you get women to want to move up there? To the forest where everybody's just does moose hunting. And this has actually become like an issue of industrial policy in Sweden. Wow. And it's sort of things like, so the houses we're building to attract people up here, if we build them with stables, we can actually attract women who are interested in horses to come and live here. And it really is about these things, and that is actually, and their main issue is getting people. And that's what I mean. It's also gender bias is affecting what we see as industrial policy, and obviously getting the care infrastructure. You're building completely new industries in the middle of nowhere. You need hospitals, so you need people working in those hospitals. That's also industrial policy. You need care workers. It's that sort of holistic view of the economy that needs to come. You need to bring with you when you try to do these things, because otherwise it's very, very much easier to fail. Okay,
we have time for one more question. I saw one over on that side. And we have to keep it quick. So quick question, quick answer.
Okay, there's three phases here. Kevin Hardy.
We don't have time for
super quick. Defensive statement. I'm a Brit. The food's not that bad. Thank you. One supporter. Second is a fundamental belief, and this is a quote from Benjamin Franklin, which is an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. And the utopian question. There's a disconnect sometimes between politics and economics. If you were given a utopian wish from an economist standpoint, what would you provide as advice to governments across the world?
Okay. So quick answers for all, because running out of time.
I'm going to sidestep this and say, in the end, economics is politics, yeah? No, really. I mean, the market itself is defined through political means. Yeah? 200 years ago, it was totally legal to buy and sell people in the United States, in Brazil, in many countries. Yeah? Child labor is legal. What is the part of the economy is actually defined by politics. Yeah? In some countries, healthcare is not commercial at all. Yeah? In other countries, it is at the heart of commercial enterprise, like in the US. Yeah? So the politics is economics. So we'll never actually have the utopia where we have this pure technocrats and politicians are all docile and good-hearted. Yeah? No, because these economists, even those technocrats will be political in the deepest sense. So there you are.
Great. Katrine?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that what I started with, that question, what about women? Sort of keep asking that in every area, and you will see a lot of new things, you will get a lot of new ideas, and I think you will be able to then create much more sustainable policy.
Okay, Nathan?
I think the returns to knowledge are indeed very high. I think we discount too much the social returns to care work and other parts of the economy and other sectors. And we massively undervalue the returns on those. And I think they're huge. I think they're very high socially. In that sense, I think policymakers should take more, focus on them more in general.
Okay. All right, with that, thank you, Katrine, Ha-Joon, and Nathan. Thank you as well for listening. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.